Hi there, Jeff here from the Wetsuit Centre, talking to you today about wetsuit thickness and what thickness of wetsuit you should go for depending on your circumstances. Okay, so thickness of wetsuit comes down to a few sort of key questions that we typically ask people, just to give us an indication of what thickness of wetsuit would be best for them. The first thing, before we say those questions, will probably be just to explain typically how wetsuit thickness works. If I grab a little example wetsuit here, with this sort of standard multi-purpose wetsuit, this is a kid's one here, this is a 3-2. And when you're reading sort of 3-2 or 4-3 or 5-3 or 6-4, whatever it is, that's basically an indication of how thick the wetsuit is in a few different places, and that's done in millimetres. So you've got 3-2 here, and that's 3mm and 2mm thick. Okay. Now typically they will use the thicker neoprene on the lower part of the body or around the core where warmth is paramount. So that would be sort of like from under the shoulders right the way through, just to give you a nice bit of thickness, keep your core nice and warm. And then over the shoulders they'll use the 2mm neoprene, okay, and that will give you more flexibility and stretch and movement where you need it, okay. So when we're actually talking about thicknesses like 3-2, 4-3, 5-3, we're basically talking about the thickest of neoprene, which will typically be constructed in that way. Sometimes it's 5-4-3, and what that will usually mean, the 4mm will be under the arms or something like that to connect the 5, then 4, then 3, so it'll be sort of like staggered that way, but you can take it as a rule of thumb that in the lower body the thicker neoprene will be used. It's a bit different with swimming wetsuits. With swimming wetsuits there's other factors to consider. You've got buoyancy basically and correcting the posture within the water. So sometimes the paneling will be different within a swimming wetsuit. They might use a lot of the thicker neoprene around the bum and hips to give you lift in the water for sort of less efficient swimmers. Okay, but typically warmth is kind of like second. It's really more about buoyancy and getting the sort of paneling of the suit right. But in a swimming wetsuit you will find very rarely will it go over 4 or 5mm, and that neoprene will be used around the heavier parts of the body to give you lift and to really just sort of correct your posture, make your posture the most efficient it can be when you're swimming in water. Okay, so going back to the questions basically that we ask customers to gauge whether or what thickness of wetsuit would be best for them. Probably the top of the list that we'd ask is what time of year and what water temperature and whereabouts are you going to be using the wetsuit. Okay, now this is one you'll find a few charts online that are available, quite useful, but from my personal point of view this is the way that I see it. So if you're talking about the thickest, or in summertime, basically the typical water temperature in the UK. So kind of like from June, July, August and even into September you're going to see water temperatures sort of from 16 up to 19 degrees on the south coast. The further you go up the country, and obviously the north of Scotland and those sort of places, you're going to be seeing the water temperatures dip down probably 13 degrees, maybe even lower than that. But typically sort of like 14 degrees Celsius, upwards up to 19, you'd be getting away with a 3-2 wetsuit, okay, which is a summer wetsuit we would call them basically. The 3-2 will give you lots of flexibility in movement, so not too much restriction. It's more versatility with the seams because having a thermal lined, fully warm, sealed wetsuit is less important. So it's less important to really sort of throw tons and tons of cash. Super warm wetsuit, because as the water is warmer, flexibility is really the sort of key performance indicator people will look for in a summer wetsuit. So kind of like for me, for like a 14-15 degrees upwards is going to be a 3-2 wetsuit depending on your tolerance for the cold. If you're someone that really feels the cold, then you might be looking around about that sort of like 15 degree or 16 degree lower, even higher, you might be looking at a 4mm wetsuit. So if you are someone that really feels the cold, then it is a sensible idea to look at a 4mm wetsuit for the majority of the summer months, just to make sure you really don't feel the cold too much. And let's face it, basically you never get, it's always much worse to be too cold than it is to be a bit too warm in a wetsuit, because if you're a bit too warm you can just let some water in, okay? If you're someone that really doesn't feel the cold in those sort of summer months again, then you might be looking at something like a shorty. With a shorty wetsuit they tend to typically be, it's another kid's one, 2mm all over. There is a couple of manufacturers that do a 3-2 in a shorty, so 3mm in the lower body, 2mm in the upper body, and there's some that do like a 1mm wetsuit, which tends to be more the sort of like fashion-y styled wetsuits and sort of sleeveless wetsuits, that kind of thing. So really just think about your tolerance for the cold, but if you're someone that really doesn't feel the cold, then you're going to be sort of looking at a shorty for maximum amount of movement. We find that is typical with a lot of people who've got a generally sort of average sort of tolerance for the cold. In the real key months, whether towards temperatures like 19, 20 degrees, they'll jump into a shorty, especially on nicer days where the air temperature is quite good. And obviously if you're heading somewhere tropical, then you can get away with 2 or more wetsuits or no wetsuit at all. Okay, so typically for me, that's kind of what you'd be using a 3-2 wetsuit for. So just have a little look at the water temperature where you are, think about your tolerance for the cold and how much you want flexibility, and you can gauge the wetsuit on that. And again, if you're someone that really feels the cold, then going for a 4-3 is not going to be a bad idea, basically. Okay, so if we move further down, then you're looking at a 4-3 wetsuit, or further up, I should say, depending on we're talking about thickness. A 4-3 wetsuit is typically going to be used in kind of spring and then autumn as well. A lot of people have a 4-3 wetsuit sort of in between seasons, those sort of spring and autumn seasons, where it's starting to get a bit colder, or it is still a bit cold, but they really don't want to be cooped up in a 5mm wetsuit. Okay, and again, people that feel the cold a lot through the summer, 4mm is a good option. Okay, so 4mm, and then your water temperature there, you're typically going to be looking at sort of 10 or 11 degree water up to the sort of 14. And perhaps even a bit lower than that. You know, I've got a friend who basically uses a 4-3 all through winter, and we're talking about sort of 7 or 8 degrees basically, because he doesn't feel the cold that much. But typically you're looking for autumnal water temperatures or spring water temperatures where it's around about that sort of 10 degrees Celsius mark up to sort of 14. So you can just sort of look at the typical water temperatures for those times of year within the area you're going to be using the wetsuit, and you sort of decide whether that's going to be right for you. Okay, so that takes a big bulk of the year. The typically water temperature you're going to be looking at for those months is tends to be sort of like October, November, and then even into early December and beyond slightly. And then start of the year, it takes a while for the water temperature to warm up, but so you might be looking at kind of like mid-April through to May, and even halfway through into June that you'll get the use of that 4-3. Okay, so if you're someone that's looking for maximum flexibility, and your tolerance for the cold is really good, then you might, like my friend, be using a 4mm in the depths of winter, but typically that's the time of year that it's really going to come into its own. You're still retaining all that flexibility and movement, but you're not getting too cold in those sort of key spring and autumn months. Okay. Now, as I said before, you can use the 4mm as a really good option for people that don't want to go in the depths of winter. They only want one wetsuit. We really recommend a 4-3 for those sort of people. So people that want to jump in the water when it starts to get a bit nicer, you know, in April and a bit warmer, and then use that the whole way through right until it then gets too cold for them to bother going in again. So 4mm is a really good option for that. Okay, so it's a 4-3 wetsuit. So good thickness of wetsuit, and hopefully give you some indication if you're sort of on the fence as to whether or not that thickness will suit you. Okay, so then we go into the winter, the core winter months, or the winter temperatures, and you're going to be looking at a 5-4mm wetsuit, 6-4, we even used to do a 7-6mm wetsuit, just to sort of give you an indication of how thick they go. A 5-4mm wetsuit is the sort of standard, and that's usually non-hooded. Now we do plenty of wetsuits which are 5-4 with an integral hood, and then we do 6-4 hooded wetsuits. Now the 6mm wetsuits tend to always be hooded, basically because someone that's looking for that amount of thickness of neoprene is really going to appreciate having that internal hood to really trap all of the warm air that's leaving their body inside the wetsuit and give them maximum insulation. So temperature-wise, typically with a winter wetsuit you're going to be kind of looking 9 degrees and below Celsius, okay? Typically, we're in the Bournemouth, we're on the south coast here, the water temperature, especially lately with the milder winters, has sort of sat around about 7, 8 or 9 degrees through the winter. I know further up the country and into Scandinavia, that kind of thing, you're looking at really just above freezing temperatures of like 4 degrees and 5 degrees, that kind of things are really bitterly cold. Now, typically on the south coast of the UK, most people, if they're going for a non-hooded wetsuit, it will always be 5-4, okay? Now, if you really feel the cold, even on the south coast, below that sort of 8 degree temperature, and you appreciate having the internal hood, which is a really good way of sort of like sealing everything in, then you might be looking at like a 6mm wetsuit. But generally, to be advised, if your sort of tolerance for the cold is fairly okay, a 5-4 is a good suit to go for. And again, you can use that 5-4, you know, through autumn or into spring, basically, but you're compromising a little bit on flexibility. Okay, so there are different wetsuits within that 5-4 bracket which will focus more on flexibility and then warmth, but just read up on the wetsuit and sort of see, how that sort of, we even do videos as well, how it comes across basically. So something like the O'Neill Hyper Freak, there's a lot of blurb within the description which will really sort of suggest that it's a really performance-based wetsuit. So no thermal lining, that kind of thing, and taping, that kind of thing, but nothing too sort of heavy to really restrict the wetsuit or really concentrate too much on thermal properties. Where you've got something like the Dry Lock from XL, which is really concentrating on insulation and warmth, okay, basically. So within that 5-4 range, you can say to yourself, right, I know I need a 5-4 for UK winter times. Now, what am I using the wetsuit for? If I'm using it for stand-up paddleboarding and I really need a lot of movement in my shoulders, then I'm going to be looking at something like the Hyper Freak, with loads of flexibility. Or if I'm looking at something where I'm sort of sat in the water quite a lot, maybe snorkeling, or just surfing in a place where you're sort of like, it's quite crowded, so you're going to be waiting around quite a lot for waves, then you might be looking at something which is nice and warm. It should be something like the Dry Lock, or within the O'Neill range, the Psychotech, or the Ripcal Flash Bomb, that kind of thing. Something with thermal lining that's really going to keep you toasty and warm while you're sat waiting. Okay, so that's really down to just a bit of common sense and thinking that way basically. But in terms of the actual thickness of the suit, for those sort of periods and those water temperatures, you're going to be looking at 5 or 6 mil thick. Okay, so again, we have a lot of people, this seems to be generally, it's not sexist in any way, but it would seem women are a lot better with pain than men, but they're not as good with the cold. Okay, so typically women seem to feel the cold a lot more than men when we're talking about sort of wetsuit thickness and we're just talking to customers, that's what we gauge. And so again, going for a 5 mil wetsuit for someone that's going to use it when the surf is more frequent, like a lady that's going to be sort of surfing more in sort of the autumnal months or even into summer, there is use for a 5 mil wetsuit within those months. Just understand that obviously you're going to be compromising on flexibility. Okay, but I hope that's quite handy in terms of the thickness of the wetsuits and just a bit of advice to really sort of like focus your search a little bit. But those are the key questions to ask.